refused to vote any money for the Defense Department for anything until the USS Lincoln is brought home and the U.S. stops aiding the Saudis in their war on Yemen.
It was the first time that they said, quote, I'm getting as close as I can, I'll be paraphrasing, but it'll be pretty close. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting civilians. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting children.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The New York Times is discussing a Pentagon plan to send 120,000 U.S. troops to the Middle East to attack Iran. Now, you do recall the last big mobilization of troops, Iraq. It was claimed that Saddam Hussein had a large collection of weapons of mass destruction and that he was a threat to the world. That was 2002 and 2003. What followed? Shock and awe. Mission accomplished. And then the insurgency. Abu Ghraib, 5,000 American dead, and the rise of ISIS. The excuse for attacking Iran is even flimsier. Supposedly, U.S. intelligence knows of, quote, potential targeting of U.S. forces, allies, and interests by Iranian security forces or their proxies, unquote. Potential targeting? What does that mean? Military exercises? Interests? That's a weasel word, meaning things you want to take that you don't have any right to. Unfortunately, the New York Times is treating this crock of manure seriously. It listens to Saudi Arabia, which said 2 of its oil tankers were damaged in a sabotage attack off the coast of the UAE. So, the Saudis and the UAE are at war with Yemen. Is it a surprise or outrage if Yemeni forces attack them? Anyway, if the U.S. is under attack by international law, they're required to take the matter to the United Nations for action. I'm surprised if Trump even knows there's international law. Congress should do 2 things to stop the Trump-Bolton coming war on Iran and the current one against Yemen. 1, a congressional investigation. Call Trump officials under oath and grill them. Number 2, refuse to vote any money for the Defense Department for anything until the USS Lincoln is brought home and the U.S. stops aiding the Saudis in their war on Yemen. And to get that, we have to go out into the streets again massively. Some video from 2003, the huge anti-war demonstrations of those days. We went down to New York City less than 2 years after the 9/11 attack, nervously not knowing the reaction from New Yorkers. 500,000 showed up, and the New York City response was great. The right-wing slogan in those days was "Support the troops," as if the troops had decided to go to war. One of the soldiers who went to Iraq later spoke at an anti-war meeting.
In Al-Nasiriyah, we ran into what are called free fire zones. They said, look, anything that moves, kill it. Man, woman, dog, child, cat, whatever, shoot it. So that's what we were doing. And as we continued further north through the country, we kept doing the same thing. I was involved, and this was I'm going to get into my turning point. My turning point in the war came in a town called Ashatra. It was north of Al-Nasiriyah. We had been in a firefight. We had done what's called pretty much a drive-by. We'd pull up and open fire on a town while the rest of the convoy drove by us to secure the road. So we'd been in a firefight. We'd taken some fire from this town, and there was a report of suicide bombers in the area. As I'm sitting there, this woman comes out of the town. She's wearing a black burqa and carrying a bag under her arm. And she was walking towards a Marine vehicle about 200 yards away from me. So as she's walking out, the Marines in the vehicle start yelling at her, putting their hands up, telling her to stop. She kept coming forward. She got within about 150 yards of the vehicle, and I made a decision. I said, look, one of two things is going to happen. She's going to walk up in this vehicle and explode because she's not stopping, or I'm going to take a shot at her and put her down. She continued to walk. I had a free shot. I took two shots at her. The first shot hit her. As the second shot went off, and this is all happening split second. As the second shot went off, the other Marines in this vehicle opened up on her. They hit her with machine guns, M16s, 40 millimeter grenades. And as she fell, she was pulling a white flag out of her bag. So at this point, I threw my weapon down and started crying. I was like, what the hell just happened? Why are we here? Who are we fighting? I started questioning everything.
Speaking of Yemen, the Saudis and the UAE continue to bomb the Yemenis with the help of the U.S. war-making corporations. This man, Bryce Druzin, defaced a corporate sign of Lockheed Martin and then called police on himself. Lockheed Martin made the bomb that blew up a school bus filled with students and teachers last year. Druzin was arrested on a felony charge. Back to Syria. I'm going to show you the entrance to a hospital in Has, Idlib. Note that all medical facilities in Idlib are now underground. That's Assad and Putin at work. Now from two Syrians in Idlib.
Today I'm speaking to you about the massacres that are happening these days in Idlib. I know what massacres mean. I know what Holocaust means when I was living inside Aleppo. This massacre is so similar to that massacre, to that Holocaust which was in Aleppo. Yesterday, 3 hospitals were destroyed. In fact, hundreds of airstrikes on the head of civilians. More than 20 people were killed. More than 100 were injured. Dozens of houses were destroyed. 7 schools were eliminated. So this is nothing comparing to what's coming. That Holocaust that might not be preceded before, because now people have nowhere to go. In fact, this is the last place they might shelter in. So please, my advice or my call for you, and this is the call of people in Idlib to you, those people who are outside Syria, please, you have to have movement now. Otherwise, no time to move. It's to be or not to be. To move or to let many people die. To let millions of people massacred silently. Now you have to work on social media a lot. You have to go out in demonstrations. Then the official media might work. They might speak about. Then governments might respond. Otherwise, nothing will happen. Governments will not respond. So we, the people in Idlib, are demanding on you to move your government.
This is Gafar Sijna in Idlib countryside. The village has been attacked by many airstrikes. Assad's and Russian forces have been bombing this village violently for 5 days. As you can see, there are a lot of destruction. There are many casualties. Civilians are leaving their homes now. The village got deserted. The warplanes is in the sky now. Disappointedly, the whole world are still silent about these crimes. Share this video and show the humanity what's happening here in Syria.
The Nazi-like abortion bill in Alabama gave rise to this joke by Andy Borowitz. Actually, businesses in Alabama are quite aware that they can be boycotted and are worried. A boycott of Colorado was successful in repealing some anti-gay legislation years ago. Alabama takes in $14 billion in tourist dollars a year. And of course, Alabama is home of the legendary Birmingham bus boycott. Many business operators in Alabama are worried by this meme. Actually, if one were to do a serious boycott, it would have to be smart and be directed at the old boy power brokers. The Brazilian-American Chamber of Commerce decided to give its Man of the Year award to Bolsonaro, the fascist-minded president of Brazil. These are pictures of the protest. In the end, Bolsonaro didn't attend. The same day, there was a massive demonstration in Brazil against his cuts to education and pensions, perhaps 1 million in the streets. DC police broke into the Washington embassy of Venezuela and arrested the occupiers who were there at the permission of the de facto Maduro government. They were charged with the grave crime of interference with certain protective functions. Now, some parts of the talk by activist and writer Norman Finkelstein at CCSU last month.
Let me talk briefly about what's called the special relationship. The relationship between the U.S. and Israel. It comes up a lot now because of the courageous remarks of Ilhan Omar, the recently elected member of Congress from Minnesota. She is Somali. She was a genuine Somali refugee. As I understand it, she lived in a refugee camp for several years, 3 years, is that right? Yeah. So in many ways, she's a heroic figure. You know, all due honor, I have a lot of respect for John, what's his name, just from Georgia, John Lewis. Yeah, look, I don't like what he turned into, but in his youth, he was exceedingly courageous, principled, in many ways breathtaking. He turned into a hack, but you know that's what happens when you're in the Democratic Party too long. But if he was a hero, and he was a genuine hero, well, so is she. You know, surviving in Somalia, 3 years in the refugee camp, and she's made some recent remarks which have made waves. But interestingly enough, which is another indication of the very strange times in which we live, the New York Times coverage of her remarks has been overwhelmingly favorable. And she made some allegations about the Congress being essentially bought and paid for by the U.S. Congress. She didn't put it that way, but clearly that's what she was saying. And people were appalled, and other people were very glad she was finally saying something that everybody knew to be the case. So let me just say a few words about that Israel lobby, and then I'll end my remarks there. The Israel lobby, how it operates, is a very contentious issue in the United States. You would think there's an obvious explanation. Okay, there is the lobby, there is Congress, and how do they interact, and is it about money, what is it about? But the truth of the matter is, you can have many very well-informed people, and they reach different conclusions about how that Israel lobby works. My own view, for what it's worth, I have tried as much as I can to do my homework. My own view is as follows. And when there is a clash between U.S. national interests and Israeli national interests, when there's a clash, there isn't collaboration, but there's a conflict of interest, the lobby has next to zero power. It's reduced to a zero. So let's take an example most of you will remember because it's not so long ago. Let's take the case of Iran. When the United States, along with what were called the 5+1 powers, the 5 members of the Security Council in Germany, they reach a consensus we should cut a deal with Iran. Now, Israel was completely opposed to that deal. The Israel lobby, what's called AIPAC, the Israel lobby, it went into overdrive trying to stop that deal. What was its impact? Well, Charles Schumer from New York, he opposed the deal. Bob Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, he opposed the deal. That was basically it. People like Dianne Feinstein, she's Jewish, very pro-Israel, but when it came to a U.S. national interest, and there was a consensus that a deal with Iran was a good thing, the Israel lobby couldn't do anything. However, when there are not critical U.S. interests at stake, for example, whether or not Israel annexes the occupied territories, the U.S. doesn't really care. If Israel were to say tomorrow, we're packing up our bags, we're removing all the settlements, and we're all going back to the 67 border, the U.S. would say, fine. Actually, it would probably be pleased by that fact. So, there's no major interest involved when it comes to Israeli policy towards the Palestinians. And when there's no major U.S. interest, the lobbies are very powerful. Of course they can determine U.S. policy when there's not a major interest, then they operate, though I would say at a higher level of efficiency and a higher level of money than say the NRA or the tobacco lobby or the big pharma lobby or the Cuba lobby. They're very efficient. The Israel lobby, they have lots and lots of money. They occupy strategic posts in places like the newspapers, publishing, areas like that. And when they make a concerted effort, yes, they can achieve big things. And there's no question in my mind, at any rate, that if Sheldon Adelson wields a lot of power in the Republican Party, it's not because of his good looks. And if Chaim Sabin wields a lot of power in the Democratic Party, it's not because of his scintillating conversation. It's because they are very rich and the campaign contributions count for a lot. Some of you may have seen the recent article in the New York Times on the lobby, and yes, it's true. They do worry about donors. Of course they worry about donors, elected officials. They spend probably, I hear statistics, They spend about a third of each day just trying to get money. And Jews are the wealthiest ethnic religious group in the United States. And they are by far the largest contributors to the Democratic Party. Republican Party, it's still not that significant. It's still much higher than the Democratic Party. So of course they're going to have influence. But I think one has to be careful about bending the stick too much in the other direction and forgetting the extent to which there is a fundamental overlapping of interests between the U.S. and Israel. The last thing, I'll just spend a couple of seconds on it. What is to be done? What can we do right now? Since May 30th of last year, the Palestinians in Gaza have been involved in nonviolent civil resistance, and a particularly heavy price. The human rights organizations are kind of like the law. There are good aspects of them, but there's also a lot of cowardice and hypocrisy in those organizations. So to take one example, the human rights organizations have, in the last 20, 30 years, they've been willing to criticize Israel for using what's called in international law disproportionate and indiscriminate force. That disproportionate force basically means taking a sledgehammer on a flea, that's disproportionate force, and indiscriminate force basically means somebody coming into this room and not liking the camera person here, and therefore coming with a machine gun and just spraying the whole room, hoping to hit him, making no effort to target the use of force. That's called indiscriminate force. And the human rights organizations have been pretty decent when it came to Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9 or Operation Protective Edge. They were willing to argue, acknowledge that Israel used indiscriminate and disproportionate force. But there was one thing they wouldn't do. They wouldn't go the one further step and say that Israel was intentionally targeting civilians. And the reason why was perfectly obvious. I'm not going to give you now a long lecture on international law, but under international law, the three crimes of indiscriminate force, disproportionate force, and intentionally targeting civilians, they are of equal weight under international law. So if you're convicted, if you're accused of the crime of indiscriminate force, your crime is as weighty as if you're accused of intentionally targeting civilians. However, the public perception is very different. Most people think, well, indiscriminate force, disproportionate force, well, that's war. You know, war is all about indiscriminate, disproportionate force. The one thing the public will not accept is intentionally targeting civilians. And in the course of the demonstrations in Gaza, because they were overwhelmingly non-violent, and there was no excuse of the fog of war, and there were lots of video cameras focused on what was happening. For the first time, for the very first time, since the beginnings of the conflict coming under the scrutiny of human rights organizations, The last report from the Human Rights Council, which is a very large, very thorough, very authoritative. I disagree with them on, some points, but in general it was a very professional job. It runs to 220 pages. It was the first time that they said, quote, I'm getting as close as I can, I'll be paraphrasing, but it'll be pretty close. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting civilians. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting children. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting journalists. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting medical personnel. We conclude that Israel is intentionally targeting disabled people, people who are in their wheelchairs. Children, they're 300 yards away from what's called the fence. They're running in the opposite direction, and Israel shoots the kids in the head. Well, that's just a fact. Now, for anybody who's followed the conflict, as I have, of course Israel targets civilians, of course Israel targets children. There's just a voluminous amount of evidence. But it was the first time in an official report.
The full talk is on our website in the YouTube section. In London, 10 to 15,000 people came out in support of Palestinians on Nakba Day. In the U.S., in Seattle, this exhibit was made to show the Palestinian towns that were ethnically cleansed in 47 and 48. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.